It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first research on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Ryerson University.
Thank you very much to the Diversity Institute and the VPRI, Wendy Cukier, for bringing us all together here. I think this is great that we can have an exchange of this nature. Telling you a little bit about our center. The Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement has been in existence for about 2 years, since 2011, conceived from the very beginning not as a faculty center, but as a university-wide center. We're dealing with a variety of approaches and understandings of how society works, and also very different concepts that are being used by researchers and different languages that are being spoken. And our approach has been to center the family as a framework of analysis. We're looking then at two interlocking dimensions: point of arrival, trying to find housing, trying to find information, until a hypothetical scenario at the end of this integration trajectory, when a person is supposedly perfectly integrated into Canadian society. But also the different subfields and paradigms and concepts and approaches. And I think we can easily switch some of these themes around. So in this case, I would center policy context and put the family into the periphery, being related to this policy context. I think this would be a way that we can not only think of family, but also think of the policy context and how things are related. This dialectical idea also enabled me to explore the relations between material practices and discourses and ideologies. Now, this dialectical idea is also very valuable in the way that we think about the formation of identities. And finally, dialectical method enables me to grapple with contradictions. And contradictions is not an error in this framework. It's not that I come across a contradiction and say, oops, I must have done something wrong in my method, but rather this contradiction becomes something that is not only necessary, but becomes productive.
Research on equity, diversity, and inclusion from a social justice perspective, to me, is about recognizing that there are structural inequalities and injustice generated by social forces such as racism, sexism, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism, and other oppressive relations at both the local and global levels. So to me, my triple E of research comes in examining, exposing, and excavating. And research, therefore, is to expose the unequal power relations. Who benefits? The feminist has a famous saying, the personal is political. To me, research is also about excavating, about the lived experiences of people who have been marginalized. And here it's putting them as the creator of knowledge. This is where the whole notion of embodied knowledge comes into play, that it means bringing personal feelings, emotional and spiritual connections, and a deep passions and a commitment to transform existing conditions. It's reclaiming the space. To me, research, therefore, is about transformations, seeking to make change and to dismantle some of that systemic social relations through direct practice, through advocacy, through research, through policy change, and collective actions. Recognizing that the growing need for fundamental changes and reorganizations at all levels of the society. This is where we need to be mindful as researchers that we are not replicating, in our conducting a research process, we are not replicating the unequal power dynamics. And as researchers, we need to maintain accountability to all our relations. And therefore, we must carefully choose our topics, methods, how do we share our knowledge and research. So in that sense, research methodology becomes a strategic decisions. What's the purpose of the research? And how is it going to be used afterwards? I subscribe to the participatory action research, community-based action research, because it's more in sync with the larger political project for social transformations. The research process becomes part of the organizing strategy. Quality research is research from the heart, and keeping ourselves humble and hopeful I guess we'll make the path by walking. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today about the research I'm doing as part of the Local News Research Project. And the question at the heart of the Local News Research Project is, how does local news, in this case ethnic media, construct reality, and why does that matter? So Benedict Anderson from Cornell, of course, got at this with his idea of the imagined community. And he suggests that newspapers played a key role in the evolution of the nation state because of their ability to draw people together. Cultural geographers have built on this idea, arguing that perceptions of a place are shaped by consumption of images, information, and ideas. At the heart of the project is data that we've collected on local news from a variety of different outlets. We've been looking at how much local news they produce and the role of this in shaping perceptions and the imagined community at the local level. What topics get covered in local news and what topics are ignored, just as importantly. Now, one of the things that makes our project different from most content analysis projects is that we also collect information on geographic references and stories. So once we've done that, what this allows us to do then is to make a news map for this particular story. So we can then combine all the data from the maps and associate it with other data on a combined map. It gives us a sense of the extent to which the newspaper reports on the community in the areas where they live. But you can combine this with income, poverty levels, and get at all sorts of different topics to compare, what's important to the different communities and get at this idea of what different dialogues are happening in different parts of the community based on language and culture. And I'll just wind up by saying that I have this very rich data set on ethnic media. It's from 2011, and I'm interested in sharing it, of course, if anybody needs to combine that with the kinds of work that they're doing here at Ryerson. Thank you.
I'm going to focus specifically on a SSHRC-funded project called Diversity Leads. It's a community university research alliance partnership, which involves 20 investigators from within Ryerson, many of whom are presenting today, as well as more than 30 community and other partners. We focused on the employment equity groups plus LGBT. There are clearly intersections with immigration, particularly in the GTA. We've spent quite a lot of time working through some of the theory, the definitional issues, the methodological issues. We hosted a workshop actually in South Africa, which brought people around the world to talk about some of these things. One of the challenges in doing this work is trying to find frameworks that will bridge different approaches and realities. We really are trying to find an approach that bridges different strategies, different ideological underpinnings, different paradigms, different levels of analysis across all of the areas that I mentioned. And while gender in some respects is one of the easier areas to work in, there are challenges there as well. And certainly when we start to talk about visible minorities or racialized minorities or immigrants, even within Toronto, it's challenging. If you try to compare Toronto and Montreal, it's more challenging. If you try to compare Toronto and Johannesburg, it's really challenging, but also very interesting. And the other thing I want to acknowledge is the intersectionality, which Winnie mentioned. We took a page out of public health ecological model, and our thinking was this. Public health is interesting because it has an action orientation. It also relies very heavily on both quantitative epidemiological type data as well as action research. It brings together people who operate in very positivist kinds of paradigms along with those who are focused on post-anything paradigms, including lots of emphasis on lived experience and so on. And so what we're trying to do is take that model and see how we might apply it to issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's intended to create space for a variety of different researchers coming at this from different perspectives. So at the societal level, recognizing that even though our focus is on organizations, They don't exist in a vacuum. We have to acknowledge the role of deep structures. We also have to focus on cultural carriers, the kinds of work that April is doing, and understand the importance of legislation, regulatory things, and so on. Part of the project is actually looking at media, looking at representation of different groups in the media, because we know that has a profound impact on how we see leadership and who we think belongs. We looked at boards of directors and top-level executives in the largest organizations in the for-profit, the non-profit sectors, as well as government and so on. And what we found, which is not entirely surprising, are big differences between the participation of women and visible minorities in the workforce versus their participation at leadership roles. Why this is interesting is not just because it reinforces the underrepresentation, but because it shows significant differences between sectors, which potentially are instructive. So if you look at elected leaders, women are close to 40%, but if you look at the corporate sector, they're only 17%. Similarly with racialized groups, if you look in the agencies, boards, and commissions where there have been deliberate strategies to improve representation, it's much higher than in the corporate sector. And when you intersect women with visible minorities, you find that white women outnumber racialized women by 10 to 1. I find most interesting the within-sector variances. Okay? So while we know that the corporate sector has 14.8% women in these leadership roles, some have none, and some are 50%. So arguments that there are none in the pipeline don't hold any water, and that's one of the things we really want to focus on. We also found in one of the studies that we did big differences between ethnic groups within the category of visible minority, which reinforces the problematization of that, but we're continuing to use it because it serves some purposes. When we look at the organizational level, and we have qualitative research primarily that's focused on this, combined with surveys, the interesting issues that have emerged in this is as we're identifying the barriers, we're also starting to identify what could be changed. And in fact, we now have an audit tool or an assessment tool that goes through organizations from beginning to end, not just their human resources policies, but their procurement policies, their communications policies, their government relations policies, and applies a diversity lens. So in terms of some of the quantitative data, again, as I said, you see gaps based on gender, you see gaps based on racialization, but the gaps based on gender and racialization are very large indeed. And this is true in terms of perceptions of fairness in the workplace. Whether who you know or what you know is what gets you ahead. And this is based on a survey of 17,000 people. So these results are really quite significant. You can see that half of white men think the workplace is fair compared to a quarter of racialized women. I'll end by talking a little bit about the individual level, because this is one of the things that is, from our perspective, critically important in bridging what would be considered structural approaches with neoliberal approaches. The barriers exist, the barriers are real, the research shows that to be the case. At the same time, there are things that we can do to help individuals overcome those barriers, and that is also a focus of this effort. So when we look at some of the challenges that people within organizations face in achieving their aspirations, we've identified a range of things that can be done in order to address those. And as educators, that is critically important. And when we talk about the change strategy then, we're trying to look at a strategy that addresses the barriers at the societal level, at the sectoral level, at the organizational and group levels, and also at the individual levels. Thank you.